Well, we have special guest Andrew Weekly here. Andrew, how are you?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Very good. Andrew, why don't you give us a, brief background about yourself before we really start off with the episode?
Yeah, well, Jack and Alex, thank you for having me on your program. It's a pleasure. Yeah, just a little bit on me. First, SmithWeekly Research is my company. We do a lot of participation in the junior natural resource sector, which is predominantly Canadian and Australian listed equities. Some of them are listed in the US as well. So SmithWeekly Research has been around for probably over 10 years now, well over 10 years. And so at that group, we do a couple things. We participate in the junior natural resource sector, as I said. We do so through private placements. We do so through research work in the sector. It's a very unique sector and quite difficult. If you're new to it, it's very, there's a lot of things to understand about the sector. And on top of that, we also have a small media side in which we do podcasts in the sector that cover energy and natural resources. And then also we have a membership base that follows our work. And with that work, we continue to thrive in the sector. And so we really enjoy where we are in that sector and what we do there. Just a little bit on me personally. I'm originally from Oregon, United States. Background is predominantly in business. I went to Oregon State University. Not that university means a whole bunch, but I did enjoy some time there and learned a lot of things. Specifically in university, I think the biggest things I learned was really discipline. But with that came probably some pretty good business instruction at the time, and on top of that, finance. And I really enjoyed a portion of my minor there, which was actually political foreign policy and history. And so anyway, that's a little bit back on me. As far as career prior to SmithWeekly Research, I was in the energy sector and the construction business, predominantly energy support and maintenance in Oregon on hydroelectric projects, and also did a number of government contracts for the U.S. government back then as well, and was an administrator for a lot of those contracts. Again, specialty construction, kind of more challenging, difficult construction. And so that was my my background before I started investing, which for me personally, my investments started around 2003 for me, and it's evolved ever since. So I hope that's a good overview.
And how did you specifically get into uranium?
So uranium, it was interesting in the sense that we actually started, uranium was the first thing that came to our radar probably in 2015. Actually was when it came in, and we didn't know anything about the sector, zero. And we started doing a lot of work on understanding, what uranium was used for, and kind of getting an understanding for uranium in the context that before we came to it, gold, copper, zinc, silver were kind of our focus area prior to this. And we kind of approached it with the thinking that it's, just another commodity. And as we dug into it, we just understood even more that it was very, very specialty, probably the most specialty sector of all commodities. You could certainly make an argument for that. And so from there, we just started doing research, and of course realized that this was the primary fuel for commercial nuclear reactors around the world. And that's pretty much all it's used for now. Yes, there's some other uses in medical technology, and also, of course, weapons and military applications, but generally it's used as a commercial fuel. And that's where the bulk of it goes today. And so once we started learning about that, we obviously, in order to do proper research, we had to spend a bunch of time looking at the commercial reactor sector and the industry, and understanding all of the things that go into what is arguably the best form of energy that we've harnessed as humans, is commercial nuclear power. And once you understand that, you start to look at energy quality, you start to look at energy density, you start to compare that to other forms of energy, and why that energy form being commercial reactors and, the use of fission technology, why it's been so slow to progress and all the other parts and pieces about it. So for uranium, we just started doing work as, okay, is this investable? And we spent a couple of years on it before we formed a view that you could actually, properly invest. And the issue is with it is it's a broken sector. And with any broken sector, once you understand the supply demand considerations, you can either make a choice to invest or not invest based on the data that you come up with. And so from there, we just moved forward and decided that after looking at all the data that, hey, this is a great sector. We think that commercial nuclear power is something that's going to grow in the years to come. And so far, looking back at about 2015, 2016 timeframe, it's been slow, very slow. But just in that period until now, you've seen substantial increases in terms of public policy, government policy, public opinion towards understanding that, hey, this is a fantastic technology we have. Why aren't we using it more? And so short answer, we've invested in uranium that way. That's how we came across it. And we continue to participate in the equities because we believed that really the only way to get real good investment leverage to the thesis is only through uranium equities, which are very specialty. And we just didn't think that, buying a utility or some technology company was something that we really thought would give us the maximum leverage.
Okay, so I guess just to start with, you mentioned that the growth in the sector has been slow. I would personally guess that some of that has to do with, seems like recently there's been a big push to move towards, I guess, renewable energies. I'm assuming you would make an argument that nuclear energy is a better long-term play. Is that correct?
Yeah, from the sense that, the best, it depends on your time frame, of course. But the sector in general is difficult to invest in because there's such limitations to actual listed equities that you can, get your hands on. So that's part of the constraint that we saw was, you have big tens of billions of dollars utilities predominantly listed in the US. They're US domiciled entities. They have not only commercial reactors, but they also might have a solar project or a wind project, or they have gas plants, or they have coal plants. There's some mix thereof. And so for us, just from a time frame perspective and the fact that, progress at a utility level is constrained to, you're exposed to a bunch of other businesses, but also that it's a very large business already. We saw that really the only good way to get that access would be to go into uranium. And we thought that uranium, because of its supply demand ties and the fact that the sector is completely upside down even today, we thought that that was an opportunity probably to get the quickest move, even though it's taken a long time. But on top of that, you have to understand that sometimes in order to get those significant returns, you have to be patient. And we've certainly learned this sector will teach you patience, and the junior natural resource sector will teach you patience. In exchange for those patience, you can also do really well in terms of, we're not here for a 15% return. Typically, you're looking for returns that are hundreds of percent. And we have gotten those already, but we've also had another interesting event in the sense that there's been market jitters literally for the last, call it, let's say 15 months now, in which these equities have gotten sold off with a lot of other just broad market equities, which has resulted in another opportunity to purchase these equities at an extreme discount, which in itself requires a lot of discipline. And so that's why we focused in this direction, although you have to understand the broader, commercial nuclear industry in order to, make a sound investment decision on this.
Now, in terms of what's actually caused the progression to be slow, I mean, you mentioned the YouTube video or the video Nuclear Now. That was a great reference or background of the sector. Can you go through some of the events that have really caused there to be some hesitation with nuclear adoption?
Sure. So the predominant things are basically a fear campaign. If you take a look at that movie that has come out, Nuclear Now, Nuclear Now is probably the best production that I've seen on the subject. And while there's probably a few things in there that I could identify that maybe could have done a little bit better, it's by far the best one that I've seen on and actually being in favor of the technology. Whereas there's been a very large fear campaign going back to, I would say, somewhat prior to Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a plant that had an accident in Ukraine back under, at that time it was under the Soviet Union, and the predominant factors behind that was government error, and really just government error was to blame, and also some design flaws because of government policy, which basically was be as cheap as possible, materials and components being inferior to what they should have been compared to the West at the time, or the United States. That event really put the scare with respect to radiation. And because it was poorly managed, it even compounded significantly worse. And so as a result of that, you have public opinion, which was negative, and then you also had an opportunity for many people to attack the technology. Now, granted, prior to that, the technology had been operating for probably in a military application sense and a commercial sense since sometime in the 50s. And so you have already an established track record. And so from that event, not only did the technology improve, at least in the sense that Russian technology since has been significantly improved, and that technology is probably the most widely exported technology even today, for a number of different reasons that I won't get into, or maybe we don't have some time to cover that. But basically, that event caused public opinion to be pretty negative towards the technology, based out of fear. And when you look at that and you come back to it, when you look at the history of power generation for commercial reactors, when you add up all the terawatts of power that have been generated ever since it's existed, and you compare that to the amount of deaths that are attributable to the technology, you'll find that it has by far the safest record of any other technology. Think of all the people that have died from coal, or the supply chain related to coal. Think of all the people that have, been injured or, died from big, massive solar projects and wind turbine projects, or just someone putting a solar panel on their roof and forgetting fall protection and falling off their roof. Gas, same thing. The extractive industry and the supply chain that goes with these sources of power, you'll find that on a terawatt basis, this technology is by far superior. The problem is in addition to this, you also have, during this period of time, you have the oil and gas and coal industry, which was thriving. Also, because it's a threat to their technology, you would naturally lobby and spend a bunch of money to have campaigns against it. And that's exactly what has happened. And they use these events to really promote that. Then here's the next one that came in, or though actually the one prior to that, sorry. 3 Mile Island was the first incident that occurred, the first accident that occurred. And 3 Mile Island, and don't quote me on years, but it was approximately 1979. Chernobyl was in 86. 3 Mile Island was actually a meltdown that actually went in accordance with the design. So it was contained. The structure, the design of the structure contained that meltdown. And this was a mechanical and engineering issue that caused this meltdown, but it was contained within the containment zone. And so in this sense, there was also a fear campaign applied to evacuation of the nearby area, but there was not one actual incident, short of evacuation and just confusion and people getting hurt in evacuation measures. There was not any measurable event in which someone died of radiation sickness, or there was elevated levels of radiation. There was not, because the containment dome of the structure at the time was designed to contain that. So these are probably the best engineered structures that human beings have ever devised. I mean, they are literally the best design structures that we've put out. And so people tend to forget that as well, that these are very well designed structures. They have improved, obviously, over the decades. But 3 Mile Island was one event in the US, which again added to the fear campaign. So 3 Mile Island was first, then Chernobyl, and then most recently was Fukushima in 2011, March 2011, in which there was a massive earthquake offshore near Japan. That earthquake resulted in a large tsunami that probably killed roughly, again, these numbers are rough, I don't have any data in front of me on this, but roughly 20,000 people were killed as a result of the earthquake and resulting tsunami. Thereafter, at this particular plant, which was Fukushima Daiichi plant, and by the way, at the time, Japan had some 50 odd reactors in operation, 50 some reactors. And this one plant was impacted in the sense that its backup cooling system, which is usually diesel generators, had flooded. And when you have, and this was in part due to poor design, when you have backup generators that are able to get flooded, and on top of that, you have infrastructure that doesn't allow an emergency team to bring diesel to those generators because the roads are out, the power's out, everything is a disaster. You weren't able to keep those generators running, which, and since the cooling systems failed, and then you had a meltdown. So 20,000 people died of the tsunami, and then you had mass evacuations, which killed further people in confusion. And from there, you had probably, I don't have a rough number with me, guys, but I'm going to say less than 10 people were actually impacted, and it was emergency responders that were actually impacted by the plant. And so when you measure all this together, this is very, very insignificant. However, the media will jump all over the fact that Fukushima 2011 was all about a meltdown, when in fact it was all about an earthquake and all about a tsunami that really caused the casualties and the mass evacuations. You know, people being evacuated from hospitals nearby, they didn't have proper infrastructure set up, and it was just emergency confusion in which people died. And so Fukushima, again, you look at Japan, which has a huge history in dealing with accidents and also dealing with nuclear related catastrophes, whether it be bombs or you know, in this case, Fukushima melted down. Japan today is still pro commercial nuclear power, and you have to just wonder how could those people be like that? And they're very resilient in the sense that they understand, as an island nation, that you're not going to get by importing LNG. You're not going to get by building, you know, lots of coal plants, which are very toxic and very pollution oriented, as we have realized. And so overall, you have this fear campaign, which has really restricted it, layered on top of substantial lobby money from competing sources of energy, most recently wind and solar, who have continued to slow down the progress of this technology. And you have to ask yourself, I mean, in terms of energy quality and energy density, what other options do we have in terms of superior energy technology? And there is no other option. What are you going to do? Burn coal? Are you going to burn oil and gas? Natural gas is promoted as clean. It's not clean. It's cleaner than coal, but it doesn't even compare close to what fission technology does. And so anyway, I think people are starting to warm up to the sense that if you actually do research on these topics and you actually dig into all of the incidents and you dig into the density of this energy and you dig into footprints and you look at, you know, hot topics like renewable, so-called renewable energy, which is not necessarily renewable, as people are starting to find out, that this is really the superior form of energy. And when you have superior energy running your grid, you can be successful as a nation, as a society, and you can provide a platform for people to actually thrive on. And one of the other pieces of that is I don't see how there's any type of progression in terms of energy, or even on fronts in space, or, you know, going to Mars or to the moon, et cetera, that you're going to get there via fossil fuels, or you're going to get there via somehow wind and solar. It's not going to happen. So if you want to start moving towards the Star Wars and Star Treks of the world, you have to have commercial nuclear power. On top of that, hopefully one day we'll be able to obtain and harness fusion power, which is a whole different topic. And it's something I certainly hope for, and it does impact fission because it's actually superior to fission. But it's also something that I don't have line of sight on in terms of how long it will actually take to commercial viability. And a research reactor or some type of technology that's in a research laboratory doesn't necessarily mean that it's commercially viable. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question about, why hasn't it progressed faster? And I'll just say one other thing. If you look at the U.S. military, I'll just use the U.S. military as a example. A number of other militaries have similar technology. Submarines, battleships, and carriers. These vessels have been powered by small reactors going back to the 50s. There has not been, and there's a number of, I don't have the exact number with me, guys, but it's well in excess of 100. There's well in excess of 100 vessels with the U.S. military that are powered by small reactors. And there hasn't been, at least from, of course, it would be probably secret, but from our view as a public person, we've not seen any accidents arising out of that technology. And it's been in operation for roughly 70 years now, 75 years. So it's an incredible technology. When you can take and sink a sub in the Pacific Ocean, go down to the ocean floor or what have you in a particular location and have sufficient power to run for 3 years without a fuel reload, that's impressive technology. And when you look at the Canadian CANDU reactors, and those reactors have a record-setting 980 days roughly of commercial operation without an outage. And that's a refuel time frame there. That's an impressive period in which you don't need to take the plant offline to refuel it. So there's just nothing that compares to it. And so to me, it's just become very fascinating, talking as a person that knew nothing about it in 2015, but has spent significant hours since just studying the overall thesis and, of course, the various industries. And so anyway, that's my long-winded answer. And I think it's very exciting and very much looking forward to seeing more growth. And I think that finally we're seeing significant indicators in the time that I've been here that it is gaining substantial pace.
So just circling back real quick. So you said at 3 Mile Island, there was no containment breach of the radiation. So was there a containment breach at Fukushima? Did the radiation breach the plant?
Yes, there was a radiation release, a measurable radiation release at Fukushima. So there was a substantial enough explosion from pressure. And again, I'm just speaking as I'm not a nuclear scientist, but just speaking as what I've understood from the accident, that there was radiation release. It was not substantial because you can definitely look at a lot of data and a lot of research from the various agencies and also independents that there was not a substantial radiation release, but I understand that there was. And even today, the utility there and the Japanese Atomic Authority, the NRA, those folks are actually discharging low-level radiation into the Pacific Ocean from cooling water that they had utilized there. And so to answer your question, my understanding was it was breached and there was some release of radiation, but it was a very small amount, nothing comparable to Chernobyl.
Can you touch a little bit upon the differences in the uranium in like an atomic bomb versus one of these nuclear power plants?
Sure. So you have to understand enrichment to get that. So sometimes people will see a hurricane coming to Florida, and Florida's got a couple reactors, and people think that somehow that hurricane's going to cause a explosion that would be kind of a weapons grade explosion. which it's not possible. The physics don't line up to make that possible. And why that is simply has to do with enrichment of the fuel. So all your conventional reactors today, there's some new technology coming out that might have a little bit more enrichment. And the reason for that more enrichment is to have more efficiency in terms of fuel outages, fuel efficiency, and time frame. But basically, weapons grade or an atomic bomb, for example, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% enriched fuel. Whereas the fuel used in conventional reactors today, roughly there's 430 of them operating today around the world, 430 odd reactors operating. That enrichment is somewhere between 4 and 5%. So huge difference, 4 and 5% on a commercial level. Weapons level is 90+%. And so, people often talk about, well, these things are just, bombs waiting to go off. That's not possible to get that type of reaction that would result in a weapons type explosion. And so that's one of those pieces. I was just going to say as well that with that, people have that thought process, and so it's impossible to get there. You can't get there. The science and the physics don't allow you to get to that type of situation. Now, can you have other explosions? Absolutely. These things are steam engines at the end of the day. They're under pressure. There's a lot of other things that are high pressure that can blow up. You can have hydrogen explosions. You can have these other things that will break things, but it's not like it's gonna, it's only going to be localized at the plant campus in terms of that type of situation. So whether it's a fear over the Russia-Ukraine war and the plants that are involved and that are under Russian control or Ukrainian control, or a 747 airliner running into one of these plants, generally, unless it's an intentional act, let's say someone gets control of a power facility, they turn it on in the case of, the facility that's constantly questioned in Russia, or not in Russia, in Ukraine, sorry, that's under Russian control. That facility, you could theoretically create an incident out of it, but to what benefit? Obviously both sides have been able to weaponize a little bit this plant control that's happening in Ukraine. But essentially that plant is shut down. It's what's called cold shutdown. So you would have to intentionally turn the reactor on and intentionally cause a man-made meltdown if you wanted to. But other than that, these facilities are very difficult to. You cannot create a weapons explosion even if you did cause a meltdown. You cannot create that. It's just not physically possible. With that, people talk about how these reactors are a security risk in terms of, well, someone can come in and steal the fuel and somehow make a weapon. That's not possible. You have to have cranes, you have to have transport logistics, you have to have enrichment facilities, you have to have so much stuff in terms of infrastructure. You just can't walk in and steal something and make it into a weapon. It's not possible. There's so much process that goes into getting from what is a reactor fuel to a weapons grade fuel, essentially.
So
Can we take? Sorry.
So when you're talking about the enrichment or the enrichment of the fuel for the weapons grade versus the reactor grade, so you're talking about the isotopes of uranium, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So
Okay.
you have to have a certain amount of enrichment to get to that level, which would result in the chain reaction needed to get that kind of energy release. And so in a reactor, you only need that low level enrichment, and it's a controlled reaction in which engineering has allowed you to control that reaction, which generates heat, which then generates steam, which turns a turbine. From there, you're able to put power on the grid. And so, yes, it's a substantial difference in terms of enrichment level to get chain reactions that are uncontrolled versus controlled reactions.
So do you know how they actually enrich the uranium?
That's basically a centrifuge technology. So you're essentially in layman's terms spinning to separate the various isotopes.
If we take a step back, even just going to how do you actually get the uranium from the ground? What is the process like? And if you could give us maybe something to compare it to in terms of like energy in versus energy out versus like wind or solar as well.
Yeah, I can try to characterize that for you. I don't have a lot of
Mhm.
info here, so I'm going off of my memory here, guys. I don't have a lot of my notes in front of me here, but basically, and I do have that information. I just don't have it in front of me at the moment. I'll try to pull it up as I'm talking. But basically, uranium is mined like any other mineral. You know, could be an open pit, drill, blast, shovel, you know, load haul, send it off to a processing plant that's nearby at the mine. You know, so essentially it's coming out of dirt, ore, if you will. So you first have a deposit. From there, you're going to extract that deposit, which is in the form of ore, which is a mixture of, you know, waste rock and so forth to get the mineral out of the rock. And so, you know, in the sense of an open pit, you're excavating the material, you're hauling it to a facility, you're separating the waste rock from the mineral, and all of the other components that, you know, all the other minerals that you may decide that are waste. And from there, you'll separate that out through various processes. You'll use chemicals to separate and extract that material. From there, it essentially goes from a liquefied form over to a dried form in which it's packaged, and it comes out as called a product called yellow cake, or that's the layman terms for it. Yellow cake. It's essentially a yellow powder is the finished product, and that goes into a barrel, a simple metal barrel. And so that's how it works. As far as the radiation level from that, it's all very, very low level radiation. We're talking, yes, there are protocols, and that's an additional layer in the mining sector. Is uranium has additional protocols and specifications and requirements that are governed by agencies like the IAEA, which, you know, specify what you must do in terms of radioactive safety. And so there are those additional requirements. And then, of course, transportation has to be in a certain way. And there's only certain places that allow transportation. So there's only a handful of uranium producing countries in the world. And with that, just to come back, you have different levels of grade of the mineralization. So let's use Canada, for example. A lot of the uranium that's produced in Canada actually has, it's actually a higher grade of material versus maybe uranium that's mined in Australia or in Africa. It's much lower grade in terms of the percentage uranium. And so with that comes different levels of radioactivity. With that, just to give you a context of this, you know, X-rays, radioactivity is with us in our daily lives, whether you're flying on an airplane and receiving radiation from that transit, whether you're getting an X-ray or getting a CAT scan or what have you, all of this utilizes radiation. Through potassium, for example, if you eat a bunch of bananas through potassium, and potassium is uranium. So very, 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 very low quantities that you can barely measure, but nonetheless, you're getting radioactive materials when you consume potassium. And so just to put that in context, you know, people often, you know, will talk about, oh, I can't live next to a power reactor. Well, that living next to a power reactor doesn't increase your radioactive exposure. It's the same. You know, obviously within a containment dome of a reactor, that's a different level of radiation, and it's a dangerous level of radiation within that containment area. So not to digress any further, back to the mining side. So from there, once it's produced into a form of a yellow cake, it gets sent off to a conversion facility in which it's converted into a gas at a conversion facility. There's only a handful of conversion facilities around the world, very small amount. From there, it's converted into a gas, and then it's sent to an enrichment facility, which there's even less of those, or essentially a very small amount of facilities around the world that can support it. From once the enrichment's completed, it gets fabricated into a fuel bundle, and that depends on the specifications of the end user utility and the specific reactor type that they're using. And then it's ready as a ready fuel bundle to insert into the reactor. And so fuel bundle is really just a set of rods that have pellets inside of them, which contain the uranium. And so once that fuel is spent and it goes through a reactor and that fuel is considered spent, it gets taken out, it gets put into a cooling pond, or just a cooling, cooling pool, if you will. And that's all at the reactor facility. Once it's cooled off, it just gets put into a concrete cast. So a concrete cylinder that's lined, could be lead lined, steel lined, what have you, but it's just a big concrete cylinder, if you can imagine what that would look like. And it gets stored inside that cylinder, and that cylinder protects the radiation. And those cylinders are typically stored, again, at the reactor facility, and that's it. So when you look at the total waste footprint of all reactor consumption around the world, going back to, let's call it 1960 or 1950, you could probably store this in less than half of a Tesla gigafactory. So to put this into context, all of the fuel utilized to date to generate commercial nuclear power can be stored in a Tesla gigafactory without breaking a sweat. So the footprint is very small. People talk about waste concerns. The waste is measurable, it's secured, we know where it is, it's a small footprint. This is the best waste setup you can have. How many people talk about the waste footprint from wind and solar? How many people talk about the waste footprint from household batteries and cell phones and appliances and stuff that we throw away? Yes, there are some supply chains set up to handle that recycling around the world, but there's also a lot of supply chains around the world that do not handle that waste. That waste footprint is massive. When you look at the waste footprint from commercial reactors, it's very small. We know where every bit of it is, and it all fits in a very, very small footprint compared to all other forms. When you talk about waste from coal, well, that waste is essentially burned. It's burned and distributed into the atmosphere. So that waste is all around us if there's coal facilities in your vicinity. So that's just a brief overview, probably more than what you wanted to hear in terms of just the overall cycle of it, from mine to a reactor and then obviously to storage. And so there is some recycling pieces of this as well. There's some recycling technology. Typically it's cost prohibitive, but there are recycling technologies that are in the works. But generally, again, the waste footprint from fission technology is the smallest of all forms of energy, and it's not even close.
How do people go about finding mines? Like, how do you find a mine and say this has a large uranium deposit and like know to mine for uranium? Like, because I mean, you talked about some of like the the procedures in place for dealing with, like, I guess, radioactive elements, but what happens if you're like, mining for some other element and then just so happen to have uranium? Like, how do they know?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways to do that. So, for the most part, it starts with groundwork, just on the surface. You have scintillometers, you have a number of devices you can use to measure radiation from a ground level. There's obviously a lot of airborne technology now that can identify certain anomalies in the ground to certain distances, depths in the ground, to where you can actually measure, hey, there's a different characteristic here, and we follow that up by, other means and methods in terms of on-ground work. That could be trenching, just excavating samples, rock samples from the surface, just taking samples from the surface and testing those samples. And then also, ultimately, at the end of all this, you end up drilling. And that's just a basic drill rig that drills certain depths into the ground to identify if there's mineralization. So there's a bunch of work done that's really non-intrusive at the surface level. And then from there, you follow up and you drill. And the exploration sector wastes a lot of capital, but that capital is necessary to be used. A lot of success in discovery is very rare, but it does happen. And so with that comes obviously expertise. You have to have people that know what they're doing, geologists, people that actually know how to, come up with discoveries with using the least amount of capital as possible. But the exploration sector, it's no secret, there's a lot of money that gets put into the ground that doesn't result in anything. And that's essentially what you have to deal with. That's the risk you take in exploration. If you have discoveries of mineral deposits, whether it's gold, whether it's zinc, whether it's cobalt or nickel or what have you, or uranium, a lot of the characteristics of that deposit, because there's lots of types of geology and lots of deposit types in terms of how these things are made up. You know, a lot of it also is around, is it an economic deposit? Just because you find a small intercept through a drill rig of uranium or gold or what have you does not mean it's an economic project. So there's lots of confirmation that goes into it. There's lots of economic studies, follow-up drilling, and it's quite a process. Then you get into permitting, and you get into regulatory and government relations and community relations and all the things you have to get in line to be able to actually extract it. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it, Alex, to answer your question, but that essentially is the process.
And where are the biggest uranium mines right now?
As far as uranium goes, some of the best deposits are found in Canada in a place called the Athabasca Basin. There's a number of operating mines there today. On top of that, outside of Canada, you do have a history of uranium mining in the US, places like New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, South Texas. So that's a little bit of reference for US. The predominant method of mining in the US these days, there is some conventional mining, but there's also another technique called in situ recovery. And a situ recovery is essentially drill holes or wells, if you will, in which a solution gets injected. So you have a normal landscape. You're not actually excavating, drilling, and blasting and removing material in bulk. You're actually just putting holes in the ground, injecting a solution that's a environmentally friendly solution, actually, if you can believe that, pretty impressive. And that solution is then pumped back to a processing plant that's linked up by pipeline. And it's processed in the processing plant and finished, and then the water is treated and sent back for actual disposal in the ground. So you treat the water to make sure it meets, you know, let's call it EPA guidelines, and you put the water back. And so depending on the characteristics, you know, you can't do this everywhere, and certain types of mineralization deposits and certain, you know, rocks, et cetera, hard rock and so forth isn't always amenable to this process, but a lot of stuff is. And so in situ recovery is also a very popular technique to be used also in Kazakhstan, which is also a very large uranium producer in the world as well. Lower grade than Canada. The US is much lower grade. And then you also have operations in Australia, South Australia and Northern Territories predominantly. And then in Africa, you have a couple countries, Namibia and Niger are the two prominent countries in Africa that are actually uranium production countries. Much lower grade, typically conventional deposits over there. But that's kind of just a brief overview. There's a few other countries, but that's the bulk of the primary ones.
So real quick, just to clarify, so with the in situ recovery, you're saying you more or less pump water through like a hole, and you hope that the water extracts the minerals from like the resulting, I guess, the area outside of the hole, and then you refine it, and then you just send it back after treatment. Is that correct?
That's pretty much correct, Alex. So what you do, once you determine that there's a deposit and you've delineated that deposit, you're able to put in basically injection wells, extraction wells, and monitoring wells. The monitoring wells are a regulatory thing just to, you know, monitor the deposit activity. But essentially, yes, you're injecting a solution into the ground, into the deposit, and you're actually extracting with that solution, you're actually extracting the uranium, bringing that back to the plant, taking the uranium out essentially, and treating the remaining water and sending it back into the ground. And so it's a good way. There's a lot of science and technique behind it, which I'm not an expert on, but it's a very good way to actually remove a deposit. And this is also being done in other areas as well. Copper, for example. This is actually being done with copper in Arizona as an example. So it actually is a very environmentally friendly way to extract mineral deposits. There's some give and take. You're losing some recovery, you're losing some ability to get all of the deposit out, which there's losses that happen in any mining operation through recoveries, the type of mineralization you're dealing with, and a number of other factors. But generally, that is the process with ISR. It is quite useful. It's pretty economic in most cases. And it's much better in a lot of places than just having an open ground operation, conventional open pit mine or an underground mine, for example. But some deposits are not amenable to it, and which means you have to look at conventional means, which are not bad either. But all of this comes with responsible mining, and that's why we have regulation and a set of specifications and framework to make sure that we, all mining operations should be responsible. And so, that's essentially what we have there with ISR.
So, okay, so another sort of, I guess, extraction or refining question, but I would assume that uranium is found with other elements, correct? Like you're going to have amounts of gold or silver or tin or copper or whatever else on the ground. So are these plants, I would guess the process to extract the uranium is probably different than the process to extract the gold.
Correct.
So if you're taking every bulk earth to a plant, is the plant looking for specifically one element? Like, is it only looking for uranium? Are you looking to sift out, if you have large deposits of multiple elements, are you looking to sift out every element at the same time?
Right. So Alex, on that front, what you have is it depends on the economics. It depends on these various mining operations need to have different circuits and different setups to be able to extract the different components. Sometimes the components are not extracted because it's just not economically viable. So in the example here, uranium, there is a facility owned by BHP, which is a major global miner in South Australia called Olympic Dam. And that facility actually is a primary copper deposit. So it's copper, but they also have uranium in the mineralization. And the uranium actually is extracted. It's processed separately under a different circuit, and it's actually sold as a byproduct of the copper, which, in this case, they utilize the uranium credits as discounting essentially their cost of production for the copper. So in that case, to answer your question, yes, there are instances where you don't have just a pure uranium deposit. Other times you often get vanadium. Vanadium is another mineral that is used in steel strength. Very, very popular. It's also being considered in battery technology as well. And so often, for example, in the US, as one example, a lot of conventional uranium deposits also have vanadium. But it would be it's essentially a separate process. There's some synergies in the process, but essentially you have to have a different finishing circuit for these various minerals. And so that essentially is what you do have. A lot of time you actually just have uranium, because in the particular geology of the area, you might just have uranium at one level. You might have a gold deposit, but it could be somewhere at a different level in terms of depth. Sometimes we're dealing with hundreds of meters of depth in the ground, sometimes thousands of meters, substantially different depths, different areas in which some of these deposits might be. But you're right, often you do have more than one, mineral that are in the deposit. It's just a matter of, is it economically viable to extract that as well, or just consider it waste? And so it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about gold or silver or zinc or what have you, it could be maybe not economical. So it just really depends on the deposit characteristics and the economics of that particular deposit and a potential mine, if it was to be economic to be built. There's uranium in seawater. It's very, very low grade, but at the right economics, you could theoretically come up with a process to extract uranium from seawater. It would cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars per pound to extract, but there is very, very low levels of uranium in seawater that can be extracted. The reason it's not today is because it's not economic. It's more economic to find deposits and take those into production should they be economic. But there's very interesting things just about the fact that you go swimming and you have exposure as well to radiation.
I guess in terms of the future of nuclear, how do you see it like picking up steam, for lack of a better term? Or yeah, how do we build momentum around this energy?
I think you build momentum around, again, the most important thing, the fear campaign has been one piece of it in the history books here, but another really important piece of it is, there is always resistance to change. And look, we're all resistant to change in some ways. And trust me, there's some things that probably shouldn't be changed, guys. I mean, whether you're just in life in general. But to some degree, there's always a hint towards progression as well. And we see that in different aspects of our lives. But I'll come back to coal for a moment, just pick on coal. And by the way, coal, oil and gas, these things are all necessary for our modern way of life. I mean, look at your computer, look at your phone, look at your car, look at your printer, look at your house construction, everything, even some of your clothes, even some of the food that you buy. All this stuff is coming from mineral extraction, period. And if it's not mineral extraction and you say it's coming from grown food, well, that food probably is receiving fertilizer at some point during the supply chain. And so fertilizer is coming from the ground, potash. So everything is mined. Cities are essentially a mine. If you look at a city landscape, that all came from the ground, all of it, every bit of it. So you can't live in a world where you don't have mineral extraction. So it's absolutely required. I think a lot of people just don't understand that, that their smartphone or what have you is coming from mined materials, the plastics, all of that. The petroleum industry obviously contributes substantially to that. So, while I think it makes sense to gravitate towards better technologies, and we should, there's also resistance to that change. And if you made all your money in the coal industry, you're going to be resistant to that change because it impacts your wealth. And so, today we're seeing some companies transition a little bit and they get into wind and solar, or they're an oil company and they've taken on some wind and solar projects. Sometimes it's for just appearance purposes to kind of, make someone feel happy about an oil company that has a wind farm. Yeah, that's true. Look at the coal industry in terms of we've been trying to move ourselves off of coal, speaking in the US, off of coal for, I think coal has tried to been transitioned out for probably more than 20 years now. But you still look at coal on a grid level, and coal still makes up, again, another figure here that I don't have exact, so forgive me, it's an approximation. But coal probably is still 15% of the US grid today, and we've been trying to get off of it for 20 years. Commercial nuclear power is somewhere around 20% of the US grid today. And the growth has been very, very slow for the US. And so how does it speed up? I think you have to have that slow transition. You have to have, the public needs to be better informed and actually should do their own work about what technologies actually work. Wind and solar will not work. There's no way that wind and solar works on a commercial industrial level. It's impossible. Not saying that technology can't improve, but it does not work on its own. It might work for some house, some single family house with some solar panels on the roof that might get you a good 10 to 15 years before those need to be replaced. But wind and solar is not the answer. Some people have compared wind and solar literally to burning firewood. It's not a good ultimate goal for baseload power. The commercial nuclear power industry has an uptime rate of roughly 95% on average in the US, 95% uptime. Imagine if we had this interview and the internet cut out like wind and solar did. The uptime of wind and solar, the intermittent nature of those is probably somewhere around at best 30%. As a result of that, just imagine if the internet cut out 30%, was only cutting out 70% of the time. So there has to be an understanding that, look, we have a very good technology before us. It's proven. It has had some flaws in the past, but when you look at the total generation of reactors worldwide going back to the start of this technology, you'll quickly find that it has the best performance record and the safest record of any other form. It's just that these highlight incidents really strike fear into people, and part of that has been funded by oil and gas, coal. All these folks have funded being against this technology because the reality is they know it's superior. And so I think it has to do with public awareness, understanding, and actually not taking the headline news as truth, because it's most likely not, and actually understanding, doing some work, rolling up your sleeves, getting a little bit of sweat here to do some work to sort out that, hey, you know what, this actually does work really well. And so I think that's what's really constrained it. Awareness going forward needs to happen. The industry needs to do a much better job of delineating that information to the public and to governments to prove that it actually is much better. And so that's some of the things that have to happen. I do think now you're seeing reversals. People are starting to understand that wind and solar are not going to cut it, and that the sheer footprint of these technologies is way too big. The turnover of these components is way too short. You're having, you'll have wind, freeze events, snow events that are turning these facilities off. They don't work. Solar requires the sun. It's not always sunny. Wind requires wind. It's not always windy. So there's lots of problems. Obviously, there's the infrastructure issues. There's the batteries that come with this, because people talk about storage. Well, we can have these facilities store power in batteries that we can use when they're not working. That's all great, but the footprint is too massive. It's too big. So you have to come back to, what is the highest quality of form of energy? What is the most dense form of energy? And so that is where you come back to commercial nuclear power, which is a fission reaction. Very, very substantial in terms of a difference. And like you guys suggested, what do you need to get going? Those are some of the things you need to actually improve that. And you're starting to see that. You're starting to see countries reverse policies about wind and solar. They're starting to realize that this is not a sustainable transition, and that we have to have something that's base load. We have to have something that's reliable.
So who are some of the countries that are doing, I guess, like the best job utilizing nuclear?
Yeah. So I would say, so the U.S., let me just give you, and again, guys, too many things to look at here, but in terms of just details. But just so you guys understand, let's talk about the United States. I want to pick on the United States for a bit here. The U.S. used to be a leader, absolute leader in commercial nuclear power. 1970 to 1990, there was about 70 units built around the country during that period. So a 20-year period, you build 70 units. The U.S. was a standout leader. Then, of course, you had incidents like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, which swayed public opinion, even swayed government opinion. Because when you look at the government, let's be honest, people in the government aren't necessarily the most talented people. That's the reality. Talent tends to attract to the private sector for obvious reasons. And we don't need to get into the politics of it, guys, but let's just say governments aren't always the smartest. And so in this case, the U.S. was a substantial leader in the past, more than any other country. After about 1990, there was very, very few reactors built in the U.S. Most of the fleet today, which is, let's call it roughly 95 units around the U.S. today that are operating, they're all units that were built back during that time frame, with the exception of a couple new ones. You had just a recent new connection earlier this year called Vogtle unit. I believe that the owner of that unit is Southern Power. That unit was just turned on, and it was the first connection to the U.S. grid for many, many years. What happened is you also had, during this period of time, and with the anti-nuclear lobby, you had regulators at the level of the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S., which oversees these facilities and permits the facilities. You've had different changes in terms of government policy in which that agency either slowed the progress or sped the progress. And obviously in recent decades, they've done nothing but slow the progress with what I like to call regulatory red tape, which is just bureaucracy that's dysfunctional. And with that came increased costs, increased lead times. We're talking, some of this stuff was in construction for 10 years, guys. That's just very difficult to comprehend that it would take 10 years to build one of these facilities. We've got amazing contractors. We've got amazing engineers. We proclaim to be the most advanced country in the world, but why does it take 10 years to build these things and also cost $10 billion to build them? It's just not acceptable. And the reason is just bureaucratic dysfunction, because the rest of the world, namely China, namely Russia, namely France, the South Koreans to some degree, the Japanese, these folks are all able to do it quicker and cheaper at the same quality level, if not better, which you get everything. You get all the benefits of what I just said. So that is the U.S. in terms of it used to be a leader. I hope the U.S. reestablishes leadership, but you don't do that by not supporting a domestic program. And that domestic program, guys, has been non-existent for the last few decades. So that's how the world looks today. As far as outside the U.S., you have Russia probably is the biggest export energy country in the world. Last I checked, again, rough figures, Russia's export reactor book is roughly 150 billion US dollars. So the Russia agency Rosatom has basically an order book that is about $150 billion. So Russia is the biggest exporter. They're doing things in Turkey. They're doing things in Bangladesh. They're doing things in Egypt. These are all countries that are in progress with either construction or have planned to construct a facility. The UAE, for example, just most recently connected 4 reactors over the last couple of years to their grid. And it's substantial power, is coming from now commercial nuclear in the UAE. And so when you go through all this, China has a huge program domestically. They're doing a little bit of export. The South Korea now is always been an export country to some degree, but South Korea is now looking at new construction. The French, as much as sometimes the French have other issues, the French government has always been, for the most part, very pro commercial nuclear power. And to the sense that it exports power to places like Germany, who have turned off their reactor facilities as a promise post Fukushima that they would turn off their facilities. Well, they stubbornly stuck to that plan and most recently turned off earlier this year their last operating reactors. Perfectly good reactors, by the way, guys. These things are typically built on a minimum 40-year license. New facilities are being built with the expectation that they're going to operate for 80 to 100 years. You can't even get a solar plant or a solar facility to last 9 years before it starts falling apart. You can't even get a wind turbine to give you 15 years before the bearings and everything else breaks and falls apart, let alone get support from the manufacturer who probably went out of business. Substantial difference. We're talking facilities that are built to last 40 years, 60 years, 80 years, and in some cases 100 years. That's incredible. And you look at the history, again, the US, most reactors, 1970 to 1990. Those units are still running today. They're applying for license extensions. And here you go. And it's still a huge contributor to the baseload energy grid in the US. And so that's kind of the outlook in terms of the leaders today are Russia and China. The U.S. should reconsider their policy about export and really start competing, because the U.S. will come to the table and go to a country like UAE and say, well, we'd like to get you reactor technology, but we're going to be careful about the fuel supply chain. We don't want you to have enrichment because you're a Middle Eastern country. And, we've got some reservations about that. But in the next room, China and Russia will show up and say, whatever you want, we'll give you turnkey. We'll give you operators. We'll give you engineering. We'll give you financing. We'll give you the fuel cycle. Doesn't matter. Just work with us. And the U.S. no longer has leverage to say the U.S. can't dictate terms, because they have a competitor who will give all the terms. because that competitor understands that if we supply that energy source, we have influence to that country. And you've seen that. You've seen the weaponization of energy most recently in Europe. You look at Europe, they're still buying oil from the Russians, even in wartime. So it's just, it's really an interesting geopolitical landscape. But right now, the biggest thing that I would love to see is I'd love to see the U.S. really get aggressive with taking back over the leadership with commercial nuclear completely. And so that's the landscape that you're faced with. And, it's very difficult to see, but that's what's actually happening. With that, let me just come back to a few other things. These other countries are able to build these reactors typically in 4 to 5 years, and they're doing so at a cost that is substantially less than what the U.S. is domestically doing it for. And again, I would argue the quality is the same, if not better. And that's the landscape. So there's no reason why you can't build these facilities at a cost of, $4,000 to $5,000 per kilowatt. There's no reason why you can't cut that $10 billion bill down to a $4 or $5 billion bill, and also cut that 10-year time frame down to 4 or 5 years like our competitors. And there's just no reason why you can't do that. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
Well, Andrew, this has been great. Is there anywhere, as we're winding down, where can people go to find more about you and the research that you do?
Yeah, so we're not terribly promotional here, but if anybody has interest in what we do, you can go to SmithWeekly.com and you can check that out. No pressure, but you can read about what we do there, and there's some basic things about what we do. And yeah, just SmithWeekly.com. If you happen to be on Twitter, our handle on Twitter is @SmithWeekly, and so you can check us out there as well. But come take a look. We do offer some things. Maybe follow along with us and just check a few things out, but no pressure. And yeah, that's how you can find out a little bit more about us.
Are there any resources you'd also recommend that you keep track of or that you read pretty regularly?
Yeah, on this subject, which is the primary focus of our work over the years, over these last recent call it 5-6 years. I would recommend that you do, if you're looking at the investment side, first there's a lot of work that has to be done. If you're not a natural resource investor, you've got a lot of homework. It's not easy. And we didn't even really talk about that at all on this podcast, but, or at least on this discussion, we didn't talk about it. But there's a lot of things that you should look at there, which I won't get into here. But as far as the, following the sector, American Nuclear Power Society or American Nuclear Society is a great source. I'm just trying to see if I can confirm what their website is. But that's a great place to get basically a free digest of everything that's happening in terms of, the industry. And so I would just say people should probably check that out. And I'm just checking the website here, guys. Give me just a moment here. I want to confirm that website. That website is ANS, so Apple Nancy Spencer.org. And so that's a really good website if you just want a digest of current news and events in the sector. That is a really great place to get a free sign up and get just basically a daily digest of what's happening in the sector.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. It was good to chat. Appreciate you guys taking the time, and happy to come back again and talk more if there's more interest on this subject.
Yeah, we'd absolutely like to have you on again. And with that, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. I'm Jack Alwell, and with me, as always, is my brother Alex, and with special guest Andrew Weekly. See you next time.